It was a day like any other in the dense rolling hills of the Ozarks, the kind of day where the air is thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. November 26, 2025, a date that would soon be etched into the local memory, not for its tranquility, but for the darkness it would uncover. It all began with a simple property dispute. A new survey line was being drawn, and it ran straight through an old forgotten hunting cabin. A cabin that had belonged to the Weller family for generations. The surveyors, men accustomed to the wilderness, noticed something odd, a heavy weathered trapdoor, nearly swallowed by overgrown weeds and fallen leaves, hidden just behind the crumbling stone foundation of the structure. Curiosity, as it so often does, got the better of them. With a shared heave, they pulled the heavy wooden door open. A wave of musty, cloying air rushed up to meet them, a smell so profoundly wrong it made them recoil. It was a smell of decay. Of things long hidden and better left undisturbed. Peering down into the inky blackness, their flashlights cut through the gloom. This was no ordinary root cellar. The space was vast. It was cavernous. Hand-dug, it seemed, extending far beyond the cabin's modest footprint. The rough-hewn dirt walls were lined with crude wooden shelves, and the sheer size of the underground chamber was the first of many unsettling discoveries that day. The authorities were called. Sheriff Brody Evans, a man who thought he had seen everything the Ozark backcountry could throw at him, was not prepared for this. He descended the rickety ladder, his boots landing on the packed dirt floor with a soft thud. The beam of his flashlight danced across the subterranean expanse. It was a labyrinth of shadows and secrets. The air was cold, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside. It seeped into his bones. He noted the meticulous, almost obsessive organization of the space. It was not a place of chaos. It was a place of purpose. A chilling, methodical purpose that was just beginning to reveal itself. As his eyes adjusted, the true nature of the cellar started to come into focus. It was a workshop of some kind, but the tools were not for woodworking or repair. They were for something else entirely. Saws, blades, and heavy-duty restraints were arranged with unnerving precision. But it was the scale of it all that was so deeply disturbing. The cellar was a sprawling, multi-roomed complex dug by hand, a testament to years, perhaps decades, of silent, solitary labor. A hidden world, buried just beneath the forest floor, waiting for its secrets to be told. And Sheriff Evans had a sinking feeling that those secrets would be the stuff of nightmares. The initial shock of the cellar's size soon gave way to a more profound horror. The details. It's always in the details, isn't it? On those crude wooden shelves, nestled between jars of what looked like preserved animal parts, were other items. Personal items. A faded baseball cap from a local high school team. A single small hiking boot, its laces still tied. A tarnished silver locket, frozen shut with age and grime. These were not random objects. They were trophies, each one a silent testament to a life interrupted, a story cut short. The investigators moved slowly, methodically, a sense of dread hanging heavy in the subterranean air. Every object they cataloged felt like a piece of a puzzle they wished they had never found. And the smell. That was the thing no one could forget. It was a complex and sickening odor that clung to their clothes and hair for days. A mixture of rot, chemical preservatives like formaldehyde, and something else. Something uniquely human. It was the smell of death, but not a clean death. It was the scent of a prolonged and gruesome process. Forensic teams in full hazmat gear worked under harsh floodlights, their every movement careful and deliberate. They found barrels filled with a viscous, dark liquid, and in those barrels, they found fragments, bone fragments, small human bone fragments chemically treated to halt their decay. The cellar wasn't just a place where bad things happened, it was a laboratory. The evidence painted a terrifying picture. On a large stained wooden table in the center of the main chamber, they found a collection of tools, surgical tools. Not the kind a doctor would use, but cruder, more brutal versions. They were meticulously cleaned and arranged, as if their owner had just finished his work. Next to them lay a stack of leather-bound journals. The pages were filled with a cramped, spidery script, detailing dates, observations, and procedures. These were not the ramblings of a madman. They were the cold, detached notes of a scientist conducting a series of horrifying experiments. The subject of those experiments, it was becoming terrifyingly clear, was people. The personal effects were cross-referenced with local and regional missing persons reports. The hits came back with sickening speed. The baseball cap belonged to a teenager who vanished while camping 5 years earlier. The hiking boot matched one worn by a young woman who disappeared from a nearby trail a decade ago. The locket was identified by a heartbroken family as belonging to their daughter, gone for nearly 20 years. The cellar was a tomb, a library of stolen lives. The sheer time span of the disappearances was staggering. This dark work had been going on for a very, very long time, hidden in plain sight, right under their feet. The community was about to learn that the monster from their ghost stories was real. The cabin and the land belonged to one man, Thomas Weller, a quiet, reclusive figure in his late 60s. He lived a simple life in a small house on the edge of town, miles from the family's old hunting property. He was the kind of person you'd see at the grocery store and not think twice about. Unassuming. Invisible. Neighbors described him as odd, but harmless. A man who kept to himself. No one could have imagined the abyss that lurked behind his vacant eyes. When Sheriff Evans and 2 deputies arrived at his modest home, they found him sitting on his front porch, rocking slowly in a wicker chair, as if he were expecting them. His arrest was eerily calm. There was no struggle, no denial, no surprise. Thomas Weller simply stood up, placed his hands behind his back, and allowed the deputies to cuff him. He didn't say a word. His face was a blank mask, betraying no emotion. It was this unnerving tranquility that shocked the officers most. As they led him to the patrol car, a local reporter, who had gotten a tip, shouted a question. "Mr. Weller, did you do it? Is there anything you want to say?" Weller stopped. He turned his head slowly, his gaze sweeping over the small crowd of neighbors that had gathered. His eyes were flat, empty, and then he spoke, his voice a dry, raspy whisper. His only statement, "The forest is hungry." That cryptic phrase sent a chill through the entire community. The forest is hungry. What could it mean? Was it a confession? A threat? A clue? The words echoed in the town's cafes and general stores, morphing from a strange utterance into the stuff of local legend almost overnight. The people of this tight-knit Ozark community were stunned. They had lived alongside Thomas Weller for decades. They had waved to him on the street. They had sold him his groceries. The idea that this quiet, solitary man was capable of such unimaginable horrors was a betrayal of the deepest kind. It made them question everything they thought they knew about their neighbors, and about the peaceful woods they called home. The reaction was a mixture of fear and disbelief. Doors were locked a little tighter at night. Parents kept a closer watch on their children. The familiar woods that surrounded them, once a source of recreation and solitude, now seemed menacing, filled with dark possibilities. The story of what was found in Weller's cellar spread like wildfire, each telling more horrifying than the last. Thomas Weller, the silent man, had become a monster, and his silence in custody was almost as terrifying as the evidence itself. He sat in his cell, staring at the wall, offering nothing. He had opened the door to his world of horror, and then shut it again, leaving everyone else to grapple with the darkness inside. Weller's chilling words, "The forest is hungry," became the guiding principle for the next phase of the investigation. Sheriff Evans knew the cellar was just the beginning. The real secrets were still out there, scattered among the ancient trees and hidden valleys of the Ozark wilderness. He organized the largest search operation in the county's history. Teams of volunteers, state police, and forestry experts fanned out, combing the dense woods surrounding the Weller cabin. They were looking for anything. Any disturbance in the soil, any unnatural clearing, any sign that the horrors of the cellar had spilled out into the landscape. For days they found nothing but the quiet indifference of nature. Then, a breakthrough. A search dog, trained in cadaver detection, began barking frantically near a secluded rocky outcrop about a mile from the cabin. The area was almost inaccessible, hidden by a thicket of thorny bushes. When the search team cleared the brush, they found it. A primitive gravesite. It wasn't a single grave, but a series of shallow pits, dug in a strange, almost ritualistic pattern. The ground was littered with small, handcrafted wooden markers, none of them bearing names, only strange, unfamiliar symbols carved into the wood. The air here was still and heavy, and the silence of the woods felt different. It felt like the silence of a cemetery. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to excavate the site. The work was slow and painstaking. With each gentle brush of dirt, a new horror was revealed. They unearthed the skeletal remains of at least a dozen individuals. The victims were of various ages, both male and female. The state of the remains suggested they had been buried over a long period, some for many decades. It was a secret graveyard, a final, unceremonious resting place for the people whose trophies lined the shelves of Thomas Weller's cellar. The forest had indeed been hungry, and Weller had been feeding it for longer than anyone could have possibly imagined. This discovery confirmed the investigators' worst fears. Weller was a serial killer, and his victim count was growing. But there was another, even more disturbing discovery at the grave site. Near the center of the pits, the search team found a crude structure. It was a kind of shrine. It was built from stones and animal bones, arranged in a precise, almost architectural way. And at its base they found two more sets of remains, buried more carefully and separately from the others. Dental records would later provide a shocking identification. These were the remains of Elias and Martha Weller, Thomas Weller's parents. They had been reported missing over 30 years ago, believed to have abandoned their son and run off. The truth, it seemed, was far more sinister. The forest's hunger and Thomas's dark journey had started at home. The trial of Thomas Weller was a spectacle. The small county courthouse was besieged by national media, the case having captured the public's morbid curiosity. People wanted to see the man they now called the Ozark collector. They wanted to look into the eyes of a monster. Inside the courtroom, Thomas Weller sat impassively at the defense table. He was a ghost, thin, pale, and utterly silent. He showed no reaction as the prosecution laid out its case, presenting the horrifying discoveries from the cellar and the forest. Jurors stared, stone-faced, at gruesome photos of the tools, the trophies, and the excavated remains from the shallow graves. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming, a mountain of horror built over decades. Weller's court-appointed lawyer had only one possible path: the insanity defense. The defense argued that no sane person could commit such acts. They portrayed Weller as a man broken by a traumatic childhood, a victim of his own twisted mind, unable to distinguish right from wrong. A psychiatrist testified that Weller was living in a delusional world, driven by bizarre compulsions rooted in the disappearance of his parents. The prosecution countered fiercely. They presented Weller's journals not as the ravings of a madman, but as the meticulous, organized records of a predator. They argued his methodical planning, his careful execution, and his decades of evasion were proof of a sharp, calculating, and evil mind. Throughout the proceedings, Weller's behavior was the subject of intense speculation. He never spoke. He rarely moved. He would just stare straight ahead, his eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. During the most damning testimony, when a family member of a victim broke down on the stand, Weller's expression didn't flicker. This unnerving calm was interpreted in two ways. For the defense, it was proof of his detachment from reality. For the prosecution, and for the families of the victims, it was the ultimate sign of his remorselessness. He was a man so devoid of empathy that the immense suffering he caused meant nothing to him. In the end, the jury was not swayed by the insanity defense. The sheer volume and meticulous nature of Weller's crimes pointed to a man who was in control, a man who knew exactly what he was doing. They found him guilty on all counts, including multiple charges of first-degree murder. The judge handed down the only sentence possible for such atrocities: death. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief. Justice, it seemed, had been served. But for many, the verdict did little to quiet the fear. The memory of the cellar and the empty look in Thomas Weller's eyes would haunt the Ozarks for years to come. The trial was over, but the story was not. Thomas Weller was sent to death row, and there, something began to change. For years he had been a phantom, a silent presence in his cell, just as he had been in the courtroom. He refused all visitors, spoke to no one, and simply existed. The prison staff noted that he spent his days staring at the wall, sometimes for 16 hours straight, motionless. He ate, he slept, and he stared. But as his execution date drew near, a crack appeared in his silent facade. He began to talk, not to the guards or to a priest, but to the wall. He would whisper to it for hours, his voice a low, continuous murmur, the words indistinct and lost in the acoustics of the concrete cell. A week before his scheduled execution, he made a request. He wanted to speak to a criminal psychologist, Dr. Alana Finch, who had been following the case for an academic study. It was the first time Weller had asked for anything. Dr. Finch met with him in a sterile visitation room. She said Weller looked different. The emptiness in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Fear. For the first time, Thomas Weller seemed afraid, and he began to talk. He didn't confess to the murders in a legal sense. He had already been convicted. Instead, he explained his world. He spoke of the hunger. He described it as a living entity in the forest, a presence that had spoken to him since he was a boy. He told Dr. Finch that the hunger had demanded sacrifices. It started small, animals, but it was never satisfied. He claimed his parents had tried to stop him, to quiet the forest, and the hunger had taken them. After that, he was its servant. The people he took, he said, were not his victims. They were offerings. The cellar was not a workshop of murder, but a preparation chamber. He was merely preserving the offerings for the entity that lived in the woods. His journals were not kill logs, but scientific notes on the process of transference, an attempt to understand how a life could be fed to the hungry earth. It was a chilling, delusional narrative, a complete worldview built around his horrific acts. On the day of his execution, Thomas Weller was no longer silent. He was agitated. He fought the guards who came to escort him to the chamber. As they strapped him to the gurney, his eyes darted around the room wildly. His final words were not for his victims or their families. They were not words of remorse. He looked toward the witness window, his voice a strained shout. "It's still hungry. You have to keep feeding it." And then he was gone. His death brought a close to the legal chapter of the case, but his final terrifying warning left a lingering stain. Was it the final delusion of a madman, or something else? For the people who had lived through the terror, it was a question they would rather not answer. Years after Thomas Weller's death, his case refused to fade away. It became more than just a local tragedy. It transformed into a subject of intense academic fascination. Dr. Alana Finch, the criminal psychologist who heard Weller's final confession, published a groundbreaking study based on her interviews and his extensive journals. Her work delved into the rare intersection of organized serial predation and profound delusional psychosis. Weller was not a typical disorganized killer, lost in madness, nor was he a purely organized predator, driven by power or lust. He was a terrifying hybrid, a man who committed highly methodical, complex crimes in service of a deeply ingrained, fantastical belief system. The Weller case became a staple in criminology and forensic psychology textbooks. It was used to illustrate how a killer's signature, the unique behaviors not necessary for the commission of the crime, can be driven by a personal, ritualistic narrative. Weller's meticulous preservation techniques, the shrine in the woods, the symbolic markers on the graves, these were not random acts of brutality. They were essential components of his delusion, the ritualistic steps required to feed the hunger. Experts from around the world studied his journals, analyzing the language he used to describe his victims as specimens and offerings, providing a chilling window into the process of dehumanization. The media coverage at the time had painted Weller as a simple backwoods monster, another boogeyman from the dark corners of rural America. But the academic analysis revealed a more complex and, in some ways, more frightening picture. It showed how a person could construct an entire reality, complete with its own logic and moral code, to justify the unthinkable. The case served as a stark reminder that the scariest monsters are not those who know they are doing evil, but those who believe they are doing something necessary, something important. Weller's legacy was a cautionary tale about the dark, hidden worlds that can exist behind a quiet neighbor's unremarkable facade. Today, on November 26, 2025, the anniversary of the cellar's discovery, the story of Thomas Weller still echoes through the Ozark Hills. The cabin is long gone, torn down by the state. The land is cordoned off, reclaimed by the wilderness, but the story remains. It's told around campfires, a ghost story that happens to be true. It has changed the community forever, leaving a permanent scar on its sense of safety and trust. The experts can study the case, categorize the pathology, and explain the psychology. But for the people who live there, in the shadow of Weller's Woods, there is no explanation that can ever truly erase the chilling final words of the Ozark collector, or quiet the unsettling feeling that the forest is, and always will be, hungry.